Welcome, everybody. My name is Alicia. I'm speaking to you from Talking Leaves Books. We are Buffalo, New York's oldest independent bookstore, and I know we have visitors tonight from all over the place, which I remember from the launch of our very special guest's first book. I'm so excited to be here to launch The Rabbit's Gift by Jessica Vitalis, our lovely neighbor to the north, who has been kind enough to grace us with this wonderful presentation. We're very excited to have her come to the store to sign all of her books. So anybody that ordered books, they will be signed with extra fun stuff day after tomorrow, and we'll get those all shipped out to you ASAP. We're very excited tonight because here to speak with Jessica about the adventures of Quincy Rabbit and her beautiful new book is another wonderful author. Anne Ursu has been gracious enough to come and have a conversation with Jessica about her book. And Anne, if you're not familiar with her, you should get familiar because she's just a wonderful author of children's fantasy books, the author of acclaimed novels such as The Troubled Girls of Dragomir Academy, best title, The Lost Girl, and The Real Boy, which was longlisted for a National Book Award, which is something really special. So we're very excited for this conversation. We appreciate all of your orders. We appreciate you joining us here tonight. And if anybody has questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll be monitoring them. And then after Anne and Jessica have their conversation, we will make sure that all those questions get answered. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. And I will proudly and happily introduce Anne Ursu with our featured author, Jessica Vitalis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I was so honored that Jessica asked me to host this. I got to read The Wolf's Curse early, and I thought it was extraordinary. And this book is also extraordinary. I love the way she thinks. I love how inventive her books are and the huge questions she's grappling with. And then they're also just like great stories. So this Quincy Rabbit, I adore, and you all will too. So I thought we should start, just let Jessica tell everybody about the book.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am so excited to be celebrating this launch with all of you. Before we get started, I do want to give a couple of shout outs first to the amazing Anne Ursu for agreeing to host tonight. She mentioned, or Alicia mentioned, the Troubled Girls of Dragomir Academy, and I cannot tell you enough how much I absolutely adore this book. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, please run out and do that right away. But thank you so much, Anne, for being here. And thank you, of course, to Alicia and Talking Leaves Books for hosting me. And a quick shout out to my agent, Sarah, and my editor, Martha, because they're both brilliant. And of course, to Canada Council of the Arts. So thank you. And with that being said, I would love to tell you about The Rabbit's Gift. It is a story that is a companion novel to The Wolf's Curse, which means that it is set in the same magical world, but it has entirely different characters and it has entirely different magic. So The Wolf's Curse was a spin on Grim Reaper mythology, but The Rabbit's Gift is a twist on French lore, and it's set in a mythical country where human babies are actually grown in cabbage-like plants and they are delivered by rabbits. And the story is told in dual points of view. So on one side, we have sweet little Quincy Rabbit, who is a scrawny little guy who longs to prove himself to his starving warren. And he decides to leave the warren, which is absolutely forbidden. And he's going to sneak into the human world and steal the purple carrot seeds that the rabbits need in order to survive. And then on the other side, the second point of view is a human girl by the name of Florine, and she longs to study botany, but she also really longs for a sibling to help shoulder the burden of her maman's impossible expectations. And when she catches Quincy Rabbit stealing her precious purple carrot seeds, she follows him back to the warren, and that sets off a string of events that are really quite catastrophic for the humans and the rabbit world.
That's so wonderful. Do you think you might read a little bit for us so we can hear
I would love
the
to.
book?
Sure, absolutely. So I think I will read the very short prologue that starts the book. This opens up from Quincy's perspective, and it just gives you a little taste of his voice. And then I have just a couple of short passages from Quincy and Florine, so you can get to know them just a little bit. The book starts, I used to believe that every story had a hero and a villain. Take this story, for example. There was a time when I would have insisted that the hero was me, Quincy Rabbit. Not that you'd know it by looking at me. I'm no Angora Rex or anything like that. But I am the one who saved the Warren, not to mention the future of Montperu. If that's not heroic, I don't know what is. The problem is that I'm also the one who started the trouble in the first place. That's not to say it was all my fault. I had plenty of help, not from a rabbit, from a human named Florine de Bigny. Once, I would have told you that she was the villain in this story, a stubborn, selfish, thoughtless villain. And I would have been partly right, but I would have been partly wrong too, because I've learned that sometimes the only difference between a hero and a villain is which side you're on. So after that opening, we go ahead to meet Quincy Rabbit and his entire family in the burrow. And we get to know his maman, and we get to know his huge family and all his brothers and sisters, and especially little Sylvia, Sophie, who is very, very near and dear to his heart. So the next section I'm going to read to you comes shortly after that. They've just discovered that there aren't enough purple carrots for them all to have breakfast. And so the only way that they can eat is to leave the warren, which is forbidden. It's very dangerous, but they're all starving and they have no choice. So here is Quincy Rabbit leaving the warren. Everything outside the warren felt different. It was more than the sweltering heat, more than the stark colors of the flowers dotting the meadow, more than the crunch of the unseen animals treading on pine-scented needles that had fallen in the forest surrounding the meadow. The entire world was sharper, more foreboding, less magic. My whiskers twitched and my stomach twisted. Stop with the collywobbles, I lectured myself. Maman was forever telling me not to let my imagination run away. Right now, I needed to keep my wits about me, focused on filling first my belly, then my pouch, and getting back to the warren. Maman stood guard at the warren's entrance, keeping watch for predators. The heat had crisped much of the clover, making it dry and crunchy, and even less suitable for eating than usual. Durrell, Estelle, and the rest of the transport rabbits quickly claimed the few green patches nearby, forcing the rest of us to spread out. Within moments, the whole of the meadow had been taken over. I scanned the clearing and finally spotted a small patch of greens all the way on the other side. I hated to venture that far from the warren's entrance, but my stomach insisted. Fear forced me to eat at twice my normal pace. Still, I took care not to nibble so much as a whisker's worth of the tempest's lace that grew among the clover. My ears swiveled, constantly monitoring for danger. Every rustle of leaves could be a bear's or wolf's approach, or the hawk that had plagued us all summer. A dozen times I nearly bolted for the warren. The sun beat down on my back. Sweat pooled in my mouth, causing me to drool in a most unappealing manner. My bitter thoughts returned. We shouldn't have to spend all our time and energy growing shoe for the humans. We should be growing carrots for ourselves. When I brought up the idea of getting our paws on some purple carrots, the committee only thanked me and sent me on my way. To be fair, they also said they couldn't risk upsetting the natural balance and that they'd asked Great Maman Rabbit for guidance. But it was clear that they had no intention of entertaining my suggestion. Why do they think you have to be old and gray to have good ideas? No matter, the idea was a good one, and I was going to see it through as soon as I figured out how. Maman rapidly thumped her hind foot, warning us of danger. Pandemonium broke out as rabbits lunged toward the warren. My heart thumped, thumped, thumped in my chest. I scanned the deep blue sky, then the tree line. A large red fox slunk from trunk to trunk. My nose twitched, my legs trembled. Even moving at top speed, I'd never make it back to the warren in time. There weren't any bushes or holes nearby to hide in. Foxes didn't usually go after full-grown Angora Roo, but even at 12 seasons, I was less than half grown. That's when I noticed Sophie. Sweet Sophie, tired, hot, hungry Sophie, small enough that a fox wouldn't hesitate to attack. Instead of fleeing, she huddled frozen in fear. Her bright white coat stood out in the crunchy brown grass. "Sophie," I yelled. The fox started toward her, its mouth opened, anticipating her neck. A large stick rested between Sophie and the fox. That was it, my only chance to save her. I gathered my strength, jumped. The forest fell silent. The fox's sharp teeth glinted in the sunlight. Sophie's wide eyes shined with fear. The same eyes she'd refused to open that very morning. The same eyes that had shined softly as she begged me to play hop skip with her. The same eyes that filled with laughter when Marcel told a joke, or with tears when a wasp stung the tip of her nose. So I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to ruin what happens, ruin your enjoyment when you're reading the book, but that's a little bit of an introduction to sweet Quincy and his temperament and some of the things that he cares about. And then I will just jump over to Florine. So Florine is again the human girl, and she desperately wants to unlock the secrets of the purple carrot seeds. Even though they're purple carrot seeds, they don't always grow purple carrots. And she thinks that if she can only figure out how to grow these purple carrots, she could leave a bundle out in front of our house, which is the signal for rabbits to drop off a shoe, and she would get the sibling that she longs for. So here's Florine. I fetched a shiny bucket from the well-organized shed. Jean-Andre preferred I gather water from the rain barrels, but the reflection pond was closer. Goldfish darted through the placid pool, undoubtedly hoping I'd come to gift them fresh mealworms or crickets. The lip of the bucket broke the surface, sending ripples across the pond. Water rushed inside, nearly causing me to lose my grip. I heaved the full pail up. Its thin handle cut into my palm as I made my way back to my carrots. After glancing at the house to make sure no one was watching, I sank to my knees and tipped the bucket over the parched soil, taking care to avoid the carrots' delicate greens so as not to scorch them in the already hot sun. The water disappeared almost immediately, sucked up by the thirsty ground. Working ever so gently, I nudged the thick, heavy dirt aside, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the blue jays chirping in the trees. Please let it be purple, please let it be purple, please let it be purple. Purple carrot seeds were available at the market to anyone with enough coins to pay their ever-increasing prices, as long as they were over the age of 18. It had taken several weeks for me to find a vendor willing to break that law for a 12-year-old, and then another few days to convince him to sell to the Grand Lumier's daughter. He said Maman would have his head if she ended up with another child because of my meddling, but that was ridiculous. No one in Montperu had ever been beheaded, and Maman certainly wasn't about to start the practice now. Still, it took an extra handful of coins to convince him that I'd never rat him out in the first place. Here, I must confess, my interest in this crop was something more than the detached interest of a scientist. I'd tried for years to convince Maman that we needed another child in the house, but she always insisted that the line of succession was secure with me. Besides, she said she was far too busy running the country to fuss with another child. Too busy. That was precisely why I needed another sibling. A little sister, preferably. The spotlight would be ever so much more bearable if I didn't have to stand in it alone, if I had someone to confide in. I knew I'd fall in love with my little sister the moment her face first peeked from the chute de vie. Maman would fall in love too. Her face lit up when she held other people's babies, tenderly tickling them under the chin as she cooed soft greetings. With this crop of purple carrots, my dream would finally come true.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. One of the things that, now that you have a body of work, it's interesting to look at sort of across the books and kind of what they have in common. And this is my book. Sorry, same colors. Here we go.
It does have similar themes.
Yeah, that's true. Let's just say the degree of difficulty of writing both books is extremely high. Like you picked for the first book, okay, it's going to be a wolf narrator who is telling the story that is really the protagonist's story. And yet the wolf also sort of has to grow and change, as does the boy. And then in this one, you have a dual protagonists, which means you've got half the time to develop two characters and make the stories work. So is this a masochism or?
So those are great questions. Probably a little bit of that. What really happened was that I had been writing for so long. I wrote for 13 years before I got my first book deal. And I don't actually remember now if Wolf was my 5th or 6th manuscript, but I had been writing stories and writing stories and writing stories, and they weren't selling. And this idea came to me to explore death from a wolf's point of view. And I thought, it's completely ridiculous. The entire way I'm telling the story with an omniscient narrator and footnotes, all of it's ridiculous. It's never, to my knowledge, been done in middle grade, and it's not going to sell, but none of my other books have sold. So I'm just going to have fun writing it, and who cares? And of course, that's the book that sold. And I knew as I was writing it that when I was writing, I wanted a companion novel. But I always thought in my head, I would want to do the exact opposite of death, which of course would be birth. And that's not a super great topic for middle grade readers. So I was complaining about this to one of my critique partners. Hello, Julie, if you're here. And she said, well, what about La Fille à Choux? Have you ever heard of this French silent film from 1896? And so I immediately looked it up, and it's a fabulous 1-minute silent film filmed by actually one of the first female filmmakers, which is so cool. But she dresses as a fairy, and she just prances around, and she plucks babies from cabbage and she drops them on the ground. And these are real babies that she's using to film, by the way. I was just completely captivated. It's hilarious. Please do look it up if you haven't. So I knew immediately that that's what I wanted to do. And I dug further into the mythology and realized that it's not just a French myth that babies come from cabbage. It's a much older European myth that boy babies come from cabbage and girl babies come from roses, I believe. So I wanted to put my own spin on that. And that's when I came up with the idea of having a rabbit. But as I was writing the rabbit, I was sending off pieces to my critique group, and they kept getting back to me and saying, that's great, it's great, but it sounds exactly like the narrator in Wolf. And so I knew that I needed to find a different voice. And so even though I thought I had to write another story with an omniscient narrator, I finally just said, well, let me just kind of pull this into Quincy's head, my rabbit, and see what happens. And I loved that. But as I was writing him, I really didn't want to write an entire story from a rabbit's perspective. So that's when I decided to throw in a human. And then, of course, I had to figure out how to balance their two perspectives. And I realized that in theory, I was supposed to pick one of them to be the protagonist, the main character, and one of them to be the antagonist, the villain that's stopping them from getting what they wanted. And I couldn't do that to either character. Like, I was just completely unwilling. And so I thought, well, once again, let's try to do something different. Like, I'm going to make each of them think that they're the hero and think that the other one is the villain. And that gave me some really interesting room to explore heroes and villains, but also the power of perspective and what it means to be human and what it means to make mistakes and all of that sort of thing. So that was a very long answer to what maybe was a short question, but
No, that's wonderful. A few years ago, there was a traveling Pixar exhibit. And one of the things that the exhibit talked about is with every movie, there was sort of a new challenge, a new animation challenge, whether it was Joy's dress or the hair in Brave, something they had to kind of invent. And I think that's something you are doing in your books already, is like taking on a new challenge each time. And I think that is just a great energy for a writer, and to try to bring something different and learn a new skill each time. And you do both of these narrative styles so well, but I imagine it was a lot of work.
It was a lot of work. Well, so The Wolf's Curse, I wrote relatively quickly. Usually I write my first drafts very quickly. The Rabbit's Gift was a much harder story to write. I had been telling people that I wrote it in 2020, but I actually realized I wrote it in the early months of 2021. So we were in the heart of the pandemic when we were all on lockdown. And I don't know about you, but I did not have a big creative well to pull from.
No.
So for me, this story was really just pulling it chapter by chapter, like one chapter a week, like, okay, if I can just get this one chapter out, what's going to happen? And then I'll worry about the next chapter next week. So it was a completely different process. I think it was a product of the times, but yeah, it was interesting to write a book over such a relatively long time period for me.
I did notice some resonance I felt with the pandemic. There's a part of Florine's problem is she's trying to convince her mother, who's the governor. Is she the
Grand Lumiere? So she's the ruler, the leader of the entire country. Mm-hmm.
That perhaps if they studied botany, they could grow more more carrots and things would be better, you know, and then people wouldn't be starving. And the mom is like, oh no, the great mama will provide. And it's like, and so there's sort of, you know, the daughter and another character trying to like convince her that science is cool, and her just absolutely like sticking to sort of, I have faith, and we don't need to change. Felt like perhaps there was resonance there.
Yes, there was a lot of just awareness of science and politics and tradition. And because I was writing it during the early part of the pandemic, we had that situation where vaccinations were on the horizon, but they weren't here yet. And already people were sort of picking sides of the divide, whether they were going to take them, whether they were not going to take them. And so we were just in this interesting place where I really saw our personal beliefs and our political beliefs rubbing up against science and creating a real gray area. And so that just really fed naturally into the narrative of what I was trying to do, because Florine is the daughter of the Grand Lumiere. So in theory, if she's interested in becoming a botanist, there should be nothing that stops her, because her mom can literally just issue a rule that says that science is allowed. But I had to have some reason why that couldn't happen, because it wouldn't be a very interesting story if she got her want right at the beginning of the story. And so that's when everything kind of came together for me. And I thought, well, what if I take sort of what's going on in the real world around us and the politics, and I set that against science in my book, so that Florine is literally not allowed to study botany to try to help her country, because they are afraid that it's going to offend the Grand Maman in the Moon and upset the natural order.
I think you do a really good job of that too, of showing like what her mother is thinking, and why that if you know, the consequences of offending the great mother would be terrible, and you know, and that's, she doesn't want to hurt the whole country, but in what she's not seeing is that the country is sort of hurting already.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I was thinking of, actually, I had forgotten about this until just now. The other scientific pieces, I remember while I was writing this, I had read a couple of articles about the work that scientists are doing right now to create animal-human hybrids. And that's such an interesting, horrifying idea, right? Like, there are some really good reasons to be doing sort of gene work and all of that stuff, but it also opens up really interesting implications from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective. And it also created an awareness that, wait a minute, I don't want to write this book from the perspective that it has to be all science all the time, because along with science also comes a tremendous amount of responsibility. And so that's something that I wanted to dig into also, and show the two sides of it, how it's not just one-sided. And again, that goes with the dueling perspectives in my story, where it's all about how you look at things.
Which I also felt like, you know, while like I understand how that evolved organically in the process, also spoke to the sort of the pandemic and how people were reacting to each other. And, you know, what everybody needed to see was the other person was suffering and understand and how and why. And if you led with compassion, you could figure things out. And that felt really appropriate and beautiful in these times.
Yeah, that was really important to me to fold into the story. So thank you for acknowledging that. And I think it also speaks to one of the big themes in the story that's also a really important theme in your story. And that's the kinds of stories that we tell and how we use our stories, because our human brain is wired for story. We know this about the human brain. We know that forever, since the beginning of time, humans have used stories as a way to make sense of the world, to pass down survival strategies, to shape our shared values, and also to shape how we act as individuals. And so that's something that I was really interested in looking into. I was interested in The Wolf's Curse, how stories shape our understanding of death and the afterlife. And then in The Rabbit's Gift, it was kind of the same thing, looking at how stories shape Quincy and Florine and how they see themselves and how they see each other, and how if they could just circle back to the idea you were talking about of the compassion and the empathy, that maybe there was some common ground to be found.
And it feels really important too that both of these characters are kids. And I as a middle grade writer, I will always contend that kids are so much better than adults, and they have that capacity for compassion that some adults seem to have turned off. And so, as much as both of them have their like really strong desires at the beginning, they're really able to sort of share perspective with each other eventually and learn how to work together, which feels like a very important I'm saying message, there's not a message, but for idea theme for middle grade to explore, and to take advantage of sort of the intelligence and the empathy that kids have.
Yeah, exactly. And my goal as a writer is always to write stories that are first and foremost entertaining. So I think you're asking questions that make me sound really smart, make this book sound really smart. But at the end of the day, my hope is that readers will just really love this story.
Right.
But at the same time, as they're being entertained, I do want them to ask questions about themselves and about the bigger world. So I love hearing that all those things were coming up for you as you were reading the story.
But then that's the real trick too, and especially with fantasy, is to take like, you're creating a whole world which allows you to explore these huge ideas, but none of that's going to matter if there's not compelling characters and a great story. Like, that is our very first job, is to tell a really good story. And that's something I think you manage, despite all the heady stuff I'm talking about, you manage so well.
Thank you. That has been a long road. So I actually have a funny story about that. About maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, 4 or 5 years into my writing journey, I had the opportunity to meet Chris Grabenstein, who's a New York Times bestselling author, pumps out just gazillions of really brilliant books. And he offered to read the first chapter of one of my stories for me. So I sent him my first chapter and he wrote back and he said, the writing is lovely, the story's fine, but I need to tell you the single most important job you have as a writer is to entertain your audience. And I went back and I looked at that first chapter, and the entire first chapter was just a kid sitting on the steps of a school. And that was it. So that has always been just front and center in my mind when I write. Like, if the kids aren't entertained, if the reader isn't engaged, then they're never going to get to the point where they're thinking about the deeper themes in your story.
I think it's easy as writers when we start out to not just as writing novels, but writing each novel, to sort of write that chapter where like there's a kid sitting on a rock or in their bed and they're just thinking about everything. And it's a great way for us to like figure out the character and whatever. What it is turns out is really interesting to read.
Yes, I'm really lucky. I have a really great critique group. So I always make the mistake of sending that first chapter to my critique group. And they are so fantastic. They always send it back and say, nice try, start again. I appreciate that so much, because I would go all the way down the rabbit hole, pardon the pun, with what I think is a really interesting character without realizing like that's completely the wrong place to start the story.
Well, as we heard, you did such a good job in this one with both protagonists, like putting them in a position where they have to sort of show us what they want and what they need but they're not just telling us. Like it's important and what drives the plot. So we're already hooked in.
Yeah, that was something really hard to learn. Like, there is a lot to be said for writing book after book after book that doesn't work, because then you kind of learn what does work and how to do it right. So I appreciate you saying that.
So one of the things I was thinking about as you were reading is that first chapter with Sophie. We have all of these bunnies that live in the backyard, and I am constantly worried about the baby bunnies. And I really watch them out the window. So I am basically 11 years old, which makes it easy to write middle grade. But as that reader, I'm always really hesitant about animal stories. But in both of your books, when I got this, I'm like, I know she's not going to hurt the bunnies. And I think that's a really important thing. There's a authority to your writing and a sort of a soothing sense that I know you're not going to sort of hurt the reader in that way. And I again really appreciate that.
Okay, I'm laughing because I have a confession to make, Anne. The book that I wrote that is coming out next year it had many different iterations, but the iteration before this one that I completely threw away had a rabbit that got hurt in the story. And one of my big sort of moments of realizing that story wasn't working was realizing you cannot hurt an animal in a story. It just cannot happen. So yeah, I have made that mistake too. I've made all the mistakes.
Oh, of course. And that's how you learn, right? That's the point
Absolutely.
of, of writing book after book. And this the point of revision is each time you are sort of, I think it's Zadie Smith, I think, who says fail better.
Right.
And that's what we're supposed to do each time. But I'm still really glad you didn't hurt the book.
There are no hurt bunnies in this story.
So speaking of that, I actually just wanted to say that one of the reasons I have this is a babysitter dragged me to the Animal Farm when I was very young because it was a cartoon. So I'm like scarred for life because of that. So anyway, that's my wound. But I wanted to talk a little bit about animals because you do seem to be developing a theme here, and how that came about.
Yeah, there is a great deal of irony in the fact that all of my books contain animals because I never really was into books about animals, like just did not gravitate toward them naturally. So it really stems from the fact that, again, I was trying to write a twist on Grim Reaper mythology. I didn't like how the Grim Reaper is so awful and the sort of messages that gives. And so I figured giving my Grim Reaper an animal perspective would make it more approachable. And then I was stuck with this companion novel and realized that I had to also have an animal in it. So I ended up really enjoying the process of writing these animal stories, which was kind of a delight to me. But I realized that writing an animal is kind of the same as writing a human. I mean, there is a chapter in this where I really had to get into Quincy's head and have him see the human world for the first time. But even that was really fun to write. So the process has just been sort of organic that all of a sudden I'm writing books with animals. My next book also has an animal that features heavily. So apparently it's what I do.
The thing I really loved about Quincy's point of view is you could really feel the rabbitness of him. And that's a real trick when you're writing animal narrators, right? Like their gestures and their feelings, the way their body processes emotions and the way they react is going to be completely different. But like you always knew, the wonderful line you read earlier about the whiskers, like you always knew you were inside a bunny's head.
I love that. Yeah, that was fun. It took quite a lot of research and I learned a lot about rabbits, like all sorts of interesting things. And I made some mistakes along the way again that luckily, because I'm writing fantasy, I was able to just say, well, in my world, rabbits can see color, even though in the real world, they see black and white. So some of the stuff I had to adjust and some of it I just left in there because it felt like it was right for my story.
Some Goodreads reviewers like, but rabbits, and it's like,
Totally. Yeah.
And that is why you don't go to Goodreads. Exactly. I have several more questions to ask, but I also want to urge the audience to put any questions they have for Jessica in the chat and I will ask her. But I actually do want to hear about that next book, which seems to be coming out next fall, because apparently you're some sort of wizard that just writes all the time.
It's been a long road and I'm determined to make the best of it. I'll just say that. Before I talk about that, I do want to note that I see Julie Arts just put in the chat that she posted the YouTube link for La Fiachu, that 1-minute silent video. So I definitely encourage everybody to grab that link so you can watch it later because it's just so precious.
There are so many great authors in this chat. It's really nice to see.
I haven't had a chance to go through it, but thank you so much, everybody, for being here. So next book, yes, I have a book coming out next fall and then another book coming out in the fall of 2024. So a lot in the pipeline. Okay. The 2024 book hasn't really been announced yet, but I can tell you the 2023 book is called Coyote Queen, or depending on what part of the world you're from, some people pronounce it Coyote Queen, which I think is hilarious. Sometimes when I tell people Coyote Queen, they don't have any idea what I'm talking about until I say Coyote Queen. But it is completely different from The Wolf's Curse and The Rabbit's Gift. It's not set in a fantasy world. It's a contemporary realistic story with a little bit of magic. And it is about a young girl who is living in Wyoming, and she decides to join a beauty pageant in order to win the prize money in order to help her mother escape her abusive stepfather. However, as the pageant approaches, she realizes that she's turning into a coyote.
Wow. That's really cool and also really hard. So this is your new Pixar technique for this
Yeah.
book is writing something that is realistic, which is can be so hard,
Yeah.
and also then having characters sort of turn into an animal.
Yeah, apparently. And I just realized book 4, I can say, will probably be a novel in verse. So I really am determined to just punish myself every step of this way. But
I think it's just
so much fun trying all these different things. I just feel so lucky that this is what I get to do and share stories with readers.
the energy that I think that happens when you as a writer are striving for something and trying hard things, I think really does show up on the page. You can see when someone's writing the same book again and again, and it kind of loses loses its energy, it loses its soul. But like something like this is just has so much energy and inventiveness in it, and so I encourage you to keep trying all of those things, and I will continue to be impressed.
Thank you.
With that. Oh, we have a question from Megan Reyes. Overall, what was your compared experiences between books 1 and 2, maybe from the writing perspective and or the author marketing perspective?
Oh gosh. Well, thank you, Megan, for your question. Books 1 and 2, writing them were completely different. Not only was there that very quick drafting that I talked about earlier, whereas The Rabbit's Gift took a lot longer, but when you're writing as an unsold author, there is a pressure because you want to write something that can sell, but at the same time, you have as much time as you want. You don't have a specific person that you're writing for. There's no editor on the other end who has a sort of voice in your head that you know will like or not like something. So with Wolf's Curse, I just did absolutely whatever I wanted, and it didn't matter how wild it was or how much I had read all of the craft books telling me that I couldn't do that or couldn't use that technique. I was like, you know what, I am just going to do it. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, I haven't lost anything. I've just, hopefully improved my craft, learned another technique that does or does not work. Whereas with The Rabbit's Gift, I had a really, really tight deadline. I had this book that was under contract. I had sent the first maybe, I want to say 50 pages of 2 different novels to my editor in something like December. And I didn't hear back from her until March, which book she wanted me to go with. And then my manuscript was due at the end of May or the beginning of June. So I was working on The Rabbit's Gift because I thought that was the story she would pick. I was working on it very, very slowly over the winter, but not really knowing if it was going to be my next book. And also because I have worked with Martha already, I kind of have her voice in my head. Like I kind of know sometimes some of the comments she's going to make. So it just was a completely different experience writing a second book and writing it under contract. As far as marketing, I don't know that anything has really changed. I'm super enthusiastic about my books, probably way too enthusiastic, and I'm willing to talk to them about anybody and shout about them all over the place. So yeah, that's just my thing and what I do. And I haven't really changed anything from books 1 to 2.
I love what you said about craft books, because I don't like to be told what to do, and I find craft books tend to be written from a very particular perspective about how stories should work. And first of all, they definitely don't have magic. That's not serious, but, and then the narrator stuff. Oh no, you couldn't have a narrator. So anyway, I appreciate that you two are reacting against them. And again, I think that shows because, kids don't have the same, they haven't been reading the same kind of story all their life. They are so much more open. I went into kids' books because I'd written 2 adult books and they both had light magic in them. And then I was at a thing once and someone was just like, oh, I don't like that magic stuff. I like atonement. And I'm like, okay, who likes magic? Kids like magic.
That's right. That's so true.
It is one of the many gifts of writing for this age.
It is. They'll
Speaking,
embrace anything.
what?
I said they'll just embrace anything. And I love that about writing for kids. And that's not to say, I don't want to give, if there's any writers listening who have yet to sell their first book, that's not to say that I think you can just throw craft out the window. I think you have to understand craft before you can decide what pieces of the craft you want to play with and maybe try to break some rules. But I sometimes see newer writers who just, I don't need craft, I know how to tell a story. But there really is a certain sensibility to a novel that's different than just knowing how to tell a good story.
There is. And what I always tell people is, even when I'm, recommending certain books, is take what's useful for you. But when the more they're telling you you have to do certain things, you don't have to. You just think about it. And I think there is real value to sort of knowing the rules so you can break them, but also like understanding that every craft book is one person's point of view on how it works. So you take it in, you think about it, and then, then take that and make your own rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find for me, again, my critique partners are just such an essential part of that process because they completely tell me when what I'm trying to do is not working.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I think my viewers probably want to know too, do you have critique partners that you share your work with, or are you just singly brilliant that can just pound out?
Me, oh God. No, I have a few people that I generally share stuff with, my friend Laura Ruby and Swathi Avashti, especially, who is not a fantasy writer, but is like particularly genius about world building. And also like really good at like asking those questions. Why, what, which are, when you get them are like, I don't know, but then makes for a much better book. Yes. So, I think, and then, my editor and my agent, but I think having a team is essential. Each book would be so much worse without all of those people. And also I would be so much of a worse writer with all of those people. They just help me grow, and they help me think, and they help me with the new challenges of every book. And this is, I think it is having people you trust, you can hand your book off to, is an invaluable thing. And I'm really glad you have that. I think I know some of your critique partners, and I know they're amazing. So it's really, it's wonderful.
Yeah, for sure.
I just want to see if there's any other questions, but I also wanted to ask you, what kind of a reader were you as a kid? You did not like animal books. What did you like?
Okay, so the first book that I remember being head over heels in love with is There Is a Monster at the End of This Book.
Oh, because it's the best book ever, you mean? Yeah.
Right? Yeah, just the power of turning those pages when you were told not to. So I remember that book very, very clearly from a young age. And then my family moved a lot, so I didn't own any books. So I just read anything I could get my hands on, which was usually what my stepfather was reading or whatever I could find at the library. And I was the kid who read all the time constantly, but I never really fell in love with any particular book. I don't remember rereading any books. The one exception to that, the book that I remember reading was The Hobbit, but I remember reading that just because it was my stepfather's and everybody was making such a big deal about how such a young kid could read such a complicated book. So it wasn't until
it was a flex, basically.
Yeah. And if they had asked me what the book was about, I'm not sure I could have told them too terribly eloquently. But that sort of did plant for me this idea that I was a reader, which I think is very powerful. It's a powerful seed to put in people's minds. And it wasn't until I was an adult and all of my critique partners were looking at my picture book manuscripts and they kept saying, this reads like a picture or like a middle grade novel. And I hadn't read a middle grade novel in 2 decades. So I went and just picked out a middle grade novel, and it happened to be Kit's Wilderness by David Almond. I don't know if you've read that story, but it's just beautiful. And I was just absolutely captivated. And I knew right away that those were exactly the types of stories that I wanted to write.
Some of us are not blessed with the gift of the picture book. And it is such a skill. Like I describe it as playing Jenga in a hurricane. And I admire people who do it well. And I also understand that is a skill I will not ever have.
It's a skill I want so desperately to have. I occasionally will send Sarah, my agent, a manuscript. And at this point, she's just like, Jessica, like, go rate your novels. Which is really deserved. Like, I don't have that picture book genius. Like so many.
It's the striving, though, but that's what matters.
She can keep getting manuscripts from me, whether she likes it or not. So Sorry, Sarah.
I'm sure she does not mind. I have a question about my approach to editing. How many drafts of your novels taken over the year? And do you have any advice on knowing when the book, or at least a solid first draft to be querying, is ready? For me, I would say books are 4 or 5 drafts, depending, or 6. And, they're sort of ready to go out when I have, my critique partners are like giving me surface level comments as opposed to like responding to something that's sort of, deeply, some deep structural issue. But when it's like, okay, I can't do anymore, they're just telling me about little scene things here by here, then maybe it's at least ready to try. What do you think? Was there a point when you knew Wolf's Curse was like ready to go?
I think it's kind of the same thing. I mean, for me, I almost always end up writing the first act 2 or 3 times at least and sending it to my critique partners, and they tell me, throw that away, start over. So once I finally get a sign off from them on my first act, then I usually just write the story, and it doesn't change too terribly much from that point on. So it will be that process of getting some feedback on things that need to be tweaked. And then, like you said, when it becomes more surface level. And also for me, I have this weird thing that I realized when I start to get a little bit uncomfortable with the manuscript, because in my head, I like things to be very organized and very logical. And when there starts to get to be a lot of emotion and things get very deep and very complicated, it starts to feel a little bit scary in my head. And that's kind of when I know that probably I'm on the right track and my manuscript is probably pretty close to where it needs to be.
Okay, a very important question from Gail Wilson. Are those rabbits on your earrings?
They are actually the covers of my books.
Which is amazing.
I'm obsessed. Yeah.
That's extremely cool. All right, I have a couple more questions for you, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But this has been, a hard year, a few years for people. And I would like to know if you have some books to recommend that have been published in the last few years that you really think everybody should read.
Yes, absolutely, for sure. So I am not saying this just because you're here, Anne. I've been shouting about this all over social media. One of my absolute all-time favorite books ever, The Troubled Girls of Dragomir Academy. So really, everybody needs to read that book. I also would recommend any book by the members of Middle Grade Authorcade. They have a website that you can look them up.
What's it called?
It's Middle Grade Authorcade. And I think the website is authorcade.com, and so many fabulous books there, but I pulled a couple off my shelves that I feel like have some of the similar themes we've been talking about tonight. So Hannah Shue and the Ghost Crab Nation is all about a story where a girl is wired into the interweb. It's set in the future. And that sounds like a really cool idea, but you could imagine that that has the potential to go wrong if power is corrupted and in the wrong hands. So I love that book. And another book that I think is really kind of similar to the themes in my work and your work, Anne, is The Verdigris Pawn.
Yeah, I love that one.
Brad. Yeah. So this is sort of a twist on chess, which is a game that I love, and it's super vivid and inventive. So I would encourage everybody to check that out too.
I wanted to recommend a couple too, and since I wasn't smart enough to bring them up, I pulled them up on my phone. But one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing more of in middle grade is good disability rep. And I thought there's this new book by a new author, Etta Invincible, Reese Eshman, and she sent it to me early, and I'm like, this is amazing. And it also has like a really thoughtful representation of a deaf girl who gets to like star in the story and not just like she has high stakes. She has a great story, and it takes place on this magical train, and there's a great dog. And it was really imaginative and really cool. I also
and I have to stop you there for 1 second. I don't know if you can see how hard I'm beaming. I don't know if you knew this or not, but I was actually Reese's mentor in Pitch Wars, and so my co-mentor and I picked that book and worked through her in Pitch Wars with that book. And it is so brilliant and so beautifully written. And as you said, so well done, that I'm just so happy that you brought that up. It's just a gorgeous story.
I loved it. And I haven't really been seeing people talk about it. And so I just strongly encourage everyone to read it. It does a lot of very, very, really great things. I also love Natalie Lloyd's Hummingbird, which is is the most gorgeous and hopeful story. And it's also about a girl with broken bone disease and or brittle bone disease, and the things that what happens when she goes to school and isn't given accommodations. But it's the same time, it's a story that just fills your heart with joy, which is a particular magic that Natalie has. So those are my recommendations. I think we're about out of time, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you wanted to say or talk about.
Gosh, I'm trying to think. We did a pretty good job delving into anything. I think the only aspect of the story that we didn't talk too much about is maybe just the fact that Quincy is he's a member of a huge family. And so the longing to find a place in his family and fit in is really important and drives him in the story.
Yeah.
And then I think it's also really interesting how Florine is an only child. And so her upbringing and her family and the place in her family also drives her actions, and it drives them both to do some things that they regret. And that's one of the things that I really do love about the story, is that I think all of us can relate to one or the other, and we can all relate to this feeling of finding our place in the family and wanting to find our place in the family and how our families shape us. So that's an important theme for me.
No wonder, no matter what our families look like, and everybody's family is different, and that creates it creates a different environment and feeling. And one of the things that I wanted to say too before we go is just I think this is a beautiful book for our time, that there is these values of compassion and working together and making a better world. There's a fundamental coziness about it. Even though there's a lot of danger, I also feel like the place we come to is, well, we can just be friends and we can take care of each other. And it was really nice to read that. And I think it is something that is something we all want to feel right now.
Yes.
It's to just be involved in that kind of story. And I really like the way you sort of interrogate the idea of what a hero is. And a hero isn't like going on a quest and beating people up and then taking the villain. Hero is like working together and solving problems. And I think that's amazing.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for all the great questions and just agreeing to take the time out of your schedule to talk about this book with me. I so appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I would like to thank you both so much on behalf of all of us here at Talking Leaves Books, on behalf, if I may be so bold, on behalf of everybody that attended tonight, everybody that has pre-ordered your book, everybody that is excited to read it. And if I may, it never ceases to astonish me, talking to children's authors who are my favorite, that you have this beautiful book that's a great read, and it's fun and it's exciting, and you have covered life, death, empathy, family, politics, science, and it's for kids. And it's not moralistic or preachy. It just has all of those things in it, which really only children's authors seem to be able to fold that all in and still write a wonderful, entertaining story. So on behalf of myself as a bookseller and a book lover, thank you for what you give us, and thank you for what you give us for making it fun to be a reader and a bookseller. So deeply appreciated. If anybody needs more copies of the book, we've got them. And Jessica's going to be in the store day after tomorrow to sign. So anybody that has pre-ordered their books, we're going to ship those out to you. I know you are far-flung all over the country. We're going to ship those out with all the extra swag. And please feel free to call or email or get on the website if you need more copies. And thank you all so much for coming. Anne, thank you. And Jessica, thank you. And congratulations on your wonderful new book.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.